The honourable member for Hamilton East, Stoney Creek.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And when I rise today, I'm rising as a member of the official opposition. And our role many, many times, as we see it, is to criticize and critique the government side. And this is one of those instances that it's important, I think, to give reasonable credit to the government on this initiative. I've already raised in this place, I was a little bit surprised that the government members are not taking advantage of the opportunity to explain to Canadians the significance of what they're doing. Today there's controversy around EI changes. There's a number of areas where we would disagree quite heatedly with this government, but this is not one of those. One of the things I pride myself on when I came to this place is bringing my own life experience here to talk about, to put a face to some of these things. And I am going to tell you 3 stories. I told one in this house once before. In 1949, my sister was murdered. And at that time, there was the society was greatly different than it is today. And the members of my family, one of them was arrested for a period of time and then subsequently proved that they weren't associated with the crime. And later there was an inquest, and the ultimate outcome was that the child, a 10-year-old girl, had died at the hands of persons or persons unknown, when in fact we did have a family member who later we learned had a severe mental illness, and we could satisfy ourselves that in all likelihood that was the perpetrator of that crime. But the impact on the family, the impact of that situation on my father in particular, because of where he worked at the time and the amount of time he needed to be off the job. And for a time he was questioned and detained. Fortunately, he worked for the Canadian National Railways, who were relatively understanding in this, but other people who wouldn't be. He lost wages. There was no doubt he lost wages, but at least he retained his job and his position, even when at one point in time he himself was under suspicion for the crime. The second story I'll tell you happened to myself. In 2001, my 30-something-year-old son disappeared for 28 days. And we had no idea where he went. He was living with my former wife at the time. He had had a little apartment there when she gave me a call, and I went over to check the apartment, and he was a musician. His drum kit was gone, his guitar was gone, his computers were gone. Everything had been sold. So for 28 days we were on edge. In my case, I had an employer at the time who was very understanding of the circumstances, and I had the latitude to come and go as I wished. But if I hadn't had an understanding employer, and in the case of our son, it turned out that he had developed stomach cancer and had headed to the United States to see if he could find treatment for his stomach cancer, and that was a long time ago now, and fortunately we reconnected with him. He was a man who simply felt he didn't want to burden his family. Again, if it goes back to what we're seeing in this legislation, he was worried that he was going to cost us money. Well, ultimately, when you go to the United States for health care, you do cost yourself some money, but we worked our way through that. And the good news was, as he survived, he got into a treatment down there that worked to the advantage. So, but again, had I not had an employer who was sympathetic to the situation, I would have had to rely on some recourse such as this. And so again, I give direct credit to the government for doing this. The third story I've been involved with now for maybe, well, since being elected. In Hamilton, there was a young man named Billy Mason. And Billy Mason went missing. And the word was that somebody escorted him out of an apartment with a shotgun. Well, Donna Dixon, Billy's mother, came to me for help, and over a course of time herself, and there was 3 other families in Hamilton who had missing young people. Billy was early 20s, and we were quite sure, the police were quite sure that he'd been murdered. But we kept pursuing and pursuing, and in this place you'll know I talked about the need for a DNA data bank for missing persons. But coming back to Donna, the mother of this young man, and the cost to her. She was off her job. And I talked to her recently, and she was getting some victims' help. They ultimately found out through a confession of one guy that another person had indeed murdered her son and disposed of his body. And she had to go to the court case day in and day out and listen to that. And by the way, that individual was convicted, went to prison. Guess what? He killed another man in prison. Aside from that, though, the turmoil, the anguish that this mother was living under with a son who was missing, the terror of him never coming home, and we had annual gatherings, candlelight vigils, where we hoped that Billy would return home. Living with that on one side, and then living with the fact that you have a financial burden, and then when the police finally come to you and say, by the way, Mrs. Dixon, we've got some answers for you. We've got the perpetrator. There's going to be a trial. And she works in I believe, in a daycare center. And she's going to have to spend all of that time going, because as the mother, she wanted to see the trial, the evidence. She wanted that closure so much. But again, the financial costs, and so many times in life, oftentimes you hear the great stories about all the legal bills someone has to pay when they get into situations or whatever. But we kind of forget about the lower level aspects of these things, where a person is facing a loss of income, a loss, or if they have other children, the expenses around daycare, and there's so many things to be considered. And I think when it comes to employment insurance in this country, the government should reach across the aisle to us, because right now, in my opinion, there's major mistakes have been made with employment insurance. And you should reach across the aisle, and we should come together and say, look, what can we do to make employment insurance work for Canadians, to protect Canadians, both at times like this or catastrophic illness like we had with my son? We could find a better way to do this, because it's not all about money. It's about dignity. Now, when you think, I had a little bit of a tour this summer. I went to the south shore of Nova Scotia. I went to Cape Sable Island. I went to Port Mouton and Bridgewater. I went to Charlottetown and Fredericton and St. John, New Brunswick. And I listened to the people there that had all of their concerns about the changes that were taking place around EI. People who were hard-working Canadians who all of a sudden said, I don't have anything else to go to when the fishery closes down. I don't have anything. And then the other people on the other side of it, who had small businesses, they say, look, the changes that EI are liable to force a lot of people out of our community, and when next season comes around, I'm not going to have people for the job. What am I going to do? There's certain expertise that comes with even when you're collecting crops or whatever you're doing, or the fisheries, there's expertise that develops over time that's lost. I think the government has, in that area, has made critical mistakes that's going to impact. And so they tell people that, after a certain period of time, you've got to accept a job for 80% of your salary. Well, you accept that job, and you're out of work next year, and the time comes around, you accept a job at 80% of it again, and then again 80%. Is that not going to encourage some employers to say, gee, if I keep hiring different people, I can charge less and less? Will that not depress wages? That's just an example of a conversation we could have had across this aisle before you legislate, before you make changes. There's a kind of a feeling in this place where we're segmented in a way that we don't come together at those times when we should. Like, some of the committees of this House work reasonably well at times, but the purpose of our committees in this place is to take a piece of legislation and make it better, not take a piece of legislation and destroy it. Now, both sides have to have confidence in one another to make that work. So when we had EI, when we had the situation where the government was planning significant changes, and the last time, Lord help us, was back, thank you, Mr. Speaker, in the 1990s when the Liberals destroyed unemployment insurance, made it an employment insurance, and started segmenting our country in a way that was just unbelievable. Workers couldn't qualify, and I can see my friend from Sudbury acknowledging acknowledging that, because he would have worked with it. We can do better in this place, and we should do better in this place. We should be working together. And so I was pleased to talk a little bit, Mr. Speaker, about our views of the employment insurance. It would have been nice to have heard more from the government side on that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.